The fluorescent lights of the diner flickered, casting a sickly hum over the silence that followed the deafening roar of gunfire. Leora Kane lay on the cold linoleum floor, the sharp scent of copper filling her senses as blood began to pool beneath her stained uniform. Every breath was a jagged struggle, a reminder of the 4 bullets she had just intercepted for the trembling woman hiding beneath the corner booth. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room fraying into darkness, but she could still make out the terrified face of Evelina Varelli, the elderly woman she had treated with kindness just moments before. Leora's hand twitched, reaching out instinctively toward her, even as her own life seemed to leak out onto the floor. Then the heavy glass doors swung open again, but there was no more shooting. A different kind of silence entered the room, one of absolute, terrifying authority. A shadow fell over Leora, tall and imposing, cutting through the haze of the emergency lights. She looked up, squinting through the pane, and saw a man in a perfectly tailored, expensive suit standing over her. His presence was like a physical weight, cold and lethal, yet his eyes were fixed on the elderly woman Leora had died to protect. "Mother?" the man whispered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that sent a final shiver through Leora's cooling skin. Cashin Varelli, the most feared name in the city, knelt beside the dying waitress. He didn't look at the carnage or the shattered glass. He looked at Leora's face, etched with the selflessness of a stranger who had asked for nothing. Evelina's voice broke the air, a sob of gratitude and grief. "She saved me, Cashin. She took them all for me." As the world finally faded to black, Leora felt a strong, gloved hand press against her shoulder. It wasn't the rough shove of her boss or the dismissive touch of a customer, it was a vow. This was the end of the invisible girl who struggled to make ends meet. As she slipped into unconsciousness, the broke waitress was already being replaced by something else, something powerful. In that final moment of the shift, Leora didn't know that the shadow looming over her wasn't death, but the man who would soon make her the queen of his empire. To understand how Leora ended up on that floor, we have to look back at the life she was desperate to escape. Leora Kane was the invisible girl, a hard-working waitress whose existence was a daily battle for survival. Every morning started the same way, with the loud, aggressive pounding of debt collectors on her thin apartment door. Her mailbox was always overflowing with red-ink notices, a constant reminder of the money she didn't have and the mountain of bills she couldn't climb. At the diner, things were even worse. Her boss was a cruel man who took pleasure in berating her in front of customers, blaming her for every tiny mistake while forcing her to work double shifts until her feet bled. She was ignored by the arrogant people she served, treated like a machine rather than a human being. Leora wanted nothing more than stability and a chance to keep her dignity in a world that seemed determined to crush it. With every passing day, her hope was fading. She began to believe that her life had no real value and that she was destined to stay trapped in this cycle of poverty forever. She felt small, unimportant, and completely alone. Little did she know, her life of struggle was about to collide with a world of power she couldn't even imagine. The diner was crowded, loud, and filled with the smell of burnt coffee when the door chimed once more. A silver-haired woman named Evelina stepped inside, looking frail and out of place in the grimy setting. She moved slowly, her eyes searching for a place to rest, but the world around her remained cold. The other waitresses rolled their eyes, whispering about the old nuisance, taking up space during the rush, and a businessman at the counter huffed impatiently as she brushed past him. Evelina looked like someone who had nothing, dressed in simple worn clothes that hidden her true status as the mother of a powerful don. To everyone else she was invisible, just another burden in an already long day. But Leora, despite her aching feet and the weight of her own struggles, saw her differently. Leora stepped away from her station, ignoring the sharp glare of her boss. She walked over to the elderly stranger and offered a genuine warm smile, the kind of kindness that was rare in this part of the city. "Here, ma'am, take my chair," Leora said softly, pulling a seat out from a corner table. "Let me get you a hot cup of coffee. It's on me." In that moment, a silent bond was formed. While the rest of the world treated Evelina like a problem to be solved, Leora treated her with dignity. It was a simple act of grace, a moral test, that Leora passed without even knowing the stakes. She didn't know that this silver-haired stranger was the mother of Cashin Varelli, or that her kindness was being watched by eyes that never missed a detail. Leora was just being herself, unaware that this small moment of mercy would soon save her life, and change it forever. Evelina sat at the small, wobbly table, her hands wrapped around the warm mug Leora had placed before her. As the steam rose, she watched Leora closely, her sharp eyes taking in the girl's every move. She saw the way Leora winced when she walked, the way her shoulders slumped from exhaustion, and yet, how her smile never wavered when she spoke to the silver-haired stranger. Leora didn't treat Evelina like a customer or a burden. She treated her with the gentle care of a daughter. Between the rush of orders and the shouting of her boss, Leora would steal a few seconds to check on her, tucking a loose strand of hair behind Evelina's ear or making sure her coffee was still hot. In those quiet moments, Leora shared small pieces of her heart, talking about her dreams of a stable life and her struggle to stay kind in a world that felt so cold. Evelina listened intently, realizing that this girl had a heart of gold, a rare treasure in a city fueled by greed and fear. She saw Leora's selfless nature, a girl who would give her last bit of energy to make a stranger feel at home. Leora had no idea who she was talking to, but she didn't care. To her, Evelina was just a mother who deserved to be loved, and for Leora, that was enough to give her everything she had. Under the flickering diner lights, a secret bond of loyalty was forming, one that would soon be tested by fire. The warm, quiet bond between Leora and Evelina was suddenly broken as a heavy chill settled over the diner. The air grew thick and still, the kind of silence that happens right before a storm. Leora looked toward the front window and saw the reflection of black SUVs pulling up to the curb, their headlights cutting through the dark like the eyes of predators. The peace shattered instantly as the heavy glass doors were kicked open. A group of men in dark suits, their faces cold and heartless, stormed into the room with weapons raised. The other customers screamed and dove for cover, but the gunmen didn't spare them a glance. Their eyes were locked onto one person, the frail, silver-haired woman sitting at Leora's table. The target was clear. These were not random thieves, they were a hit squad sent to finish a job. As the men leveled their guns at Evelina, the diner's bright lights seemed to fade, leaving only the terrifying sight of the weapons pointed at the helpless grandmother. Leora felt her heart hammer against her ribs, the fear turning her blood to ice. In that split second the world slowed down. She looked at Evelina's terrified face and knew that if she didn't act, the woman who had become like a mother to her in just 1 hour would be gone forever. The atmosphere of the diner had shifted from a place of work to a battlefield, and the invisible girl was the only thing standing between a target and her end. The first gunshot cracked through the air like a whip, shattering a sugar shaker on the table next to them. Screams erupted as the diner was instantly torn apart by a hail of lead, wood splinters flying and glass raining down like lethal diamonds. In that terrifying heartbeat, Leora didn't think about her unpaid bills, her cruel boss, or her own fading hopes. She didn't see a stranger, she saw a mother who was about to be erased from the world. Driven by an instinct deeper than fear, Leora threw herself across the table. Her small frame collided with Evelina, shoving the elderly woman off her chair and down onto the grease-stained floor behind the heavy protection of the counter. Leora didn't stop there. As more bullets ripped through the air, seeking their target, she draped her own body over Evelina's frail form, becoming a living shield. The impact was sudden and white-hot. 4 times, the world seemed to explode against her back as the bullets found their mark. The pain was a blinding roar that drowned out the sound of the gunman's heavy boots and the crashing of plates. Leora's breath hitched, her lungs feeling as though they were filling with liquid fire, but she didn't move. She held on tighter, her hands gripping Evelina's worn coat, refusing to let go until she was sure the woman was safe. As the shooters retreated and the roar of the SUVs faded into the distance, a heavy, ringing silence returned to the diner. Leora felt the coldness of the floor beneath her and the warmth of her own blood soaking through her white apron. She had always felt like an invisible girl, someone whose life held no value in the eyes of the world. But in the wreckage of that diner, she had made a choice that changed everything. She had taken the hit meant for another, and as the darkness began to pull at her mind, she knew she had finally done something that mattered. The sirens were still miles away when a heavy rhythmic thrumming began to shake the very foundation of the diner. A fleet of black armored vehicles screeched to a halt outside, their tires smoking against the asphalt. The doors of the lead car opened and Cashin Varelli stepped out into the chaos. He didn't run. He moved with a terrifying predatory calm that made the air in the room feel thin and freezing. Every witness left in the building, the hiding customers, the cruel boss, the trembling staff, froze in place. The terror was palpable, a physical weight that silenced every sob and moan as the king of the city walked through the shattered remains of his enemy's failure. The scent of gunpowder and copper was overwhelming, but Cashin's eyes were locked on the space behind the counter. He moved past the wreckage of broken glass and splintered wood, his boots crunching with a sound like breaking bone. When he finally reached the corner, the sight before him stopped his heart. His mother, Evelina, was sitting on the blood-stained floor, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was cradling the head of the young waitress, Leora, in her lap, her hands trembling as she tried to stem the flow of blood from the girl's back. "Cashin," his mother whispered, her voice cracking with a grief that cut deeper than any blade. "She's dying. She took the bullets that were meant for me." Cashin knelt in the pooling red, his expensive suit soaking up the evidence of Leora's sacrifice. He looked down at the girl, the invisible girl, who had been nothing to the world but was now everything to his family. Her face was ashen, her breathing shallow and ragged. In a world where everyone served him out of fear, this stranger had bled for his blood out of nothing but pure, selfless love. The cold fury in his eyes softened into a rare, painful respect. He reached out, his large hand hovering over Leora's pale cheek, a silent promise forming in the dark. The witnesses watched in hushed awe, realizing they were seeing something they were never meant to see. The most dangerous man in the city moved to his core by a girl who had nothing left to give. Hours later, the harsh, flickering lights of the diner were replaced by the soft, steady glow of a private medical wing. Leora lay in a bed of silk and high-end tech, her body wrapped in bandages that smelled of expensive antiseptic. The constant, agonizing roar of the bullets had faded into a dull, heavy throb, kept at bay by the best doctors money could buy. As her eyes slowly fluttered open, she didn't see the cracked ceiling of her tiny apartment or the angry face of her boss. Instead, she saw the silent, watchful figure of Cashin Varelli sitting at her bedside. The room was deathly quiet, guarded by men whose presence alone spoke of power and violence. Cashin watched her with an intensity that made Leora's breath catch. He was no longer the terrifying shadow from the diner floor. He was a man who looked at her with a debt that could never be fully repaid. When he saw her stir, he leaned forward, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of confusion. He told her that his mother was safe and that the men who had attacked them would never breathe the city's air again. But it was what he said next that changed Leora's world forever. With the authority of a king making a decree, Cashin took her hand, the hand of a girl who had spent her life being ignored, and made a vow. He announced to the room and to the world outside that no one who bleeds for a Varelli stays a stranger. He told her that her days of counting pennies and hiding from collectors were over. By saving his mother, she had earned a place at the very top of his empire. In that quiet hospital room, the broke waitress was officially gone. She was now a part of the family, protected by the most dangerous man in the city. When Leora finally opened her eyes again, the world was different. The harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the diner and the sterile smell of the hospital were gone, replaced by the soft glow of a crystal chandelier and the scent of fresh jasmine. She was lying in a bed so large and soft it felt like a cloud, draped in sheets of pure silk that felt cool against her skin. For a moment, she panicked, reaching for her stained apron and the heavy tray she had carried for years, but her hands found only a gown of fine lace. Looking around, she realized she was in a room more beautiful than any palace she had ever imagined. Large windows looked out over a sprawling, sun-drenched estate, and the distant sound of a fountain replaced the noise of the city traffic. A soft knock at the door preceded Cashin Varelli's entrance. He had traded his blood-stained suit for one of dark charcoal, but his presence was just as commanding. He didn't speak immediately, he simply watched her, ensuring she was truly awake and healing. In his eyes, Leora no longer saw the invisible girl, or the broke waitress, who had struggled to survive the streets. "You are home, Leora," he said, his voice low and firm. He explained that from this day forward she would never have to worry about a debt collector, a cruel boss, or a missed meal again. She was under his absolute protection, a permanent guest of the Varelli family. Leora looked at her hands, no longer trembling from exhaustion or fear. The life she had known, the life of rags, was truly over. She was surrounded by silk, safe within the walls of an empire she had saved with her own blood. The girl who had been nothing to the world was now the most protected person in the city, and as she looked at Cashin, she knew her transformation was complete. The engine of the black obsidian sedan purred as it pulled up to the curb of the neon-lit diner. Leora sat in the back, her fingers tracing the expensive silk of her new dress, a sharp contrast to the grease-stained apron she had worn for years. Beside her sat Cashin, his presence cold and commanding, a silent promise of the justice about to be served. He hadn't brought her here to pick up a shift, he had brought her here to settle a debt. When the heavy glass doors swung open, the bells chimed just as they always had, but the atmosphere inside froze instantly. The clatter of silverware stopped as Cashin stepped in, followed by Leora, whose head was held high for the first time in that building. Her old boss, the man who had spent years berating her and treating her as if she were invisible, hurried forward with a fake, nervous smile, his eyes widening as he recognized the girl he had once bullied. "Leora?" he stammered, his voice trembling as his gaze shifted to the dangerous man standing at her side. Cashin didn't raise his voice, but the low rumble of his words carried to every corner of the room. He made it clear that while this man saw a broke waitress, the Varelli family saw a queen who had bled to protect their own. He reminded the boss that every insult, every double shift, and every moment of cruelty directed at Leora was now a personal offense against the most powerful empire in the city. Leora watched as the man who once made her feel small now cowered in the shadow of the man she had saved. She didn't need to say a word, her presence alone was the ultimate victory. As Cashin placed a protective hand on her shoulder, he ensured the boss understood a final, chilling truth. The debt of her suffering was finally being paid in full. They walked out of the diner together, leaving behind the wreckage of her past and stepping into a future where she would never be invisible again. As the sun set over the sprawling Varelli estate, casting long golden shadows across the marble terrace, Leora stood beside Cashin. She was no longer the girl with trembling hands and a faded apron. She was draped in elegance, a silent power radiating from her every movement. Cashin looked at her not as a subordinate, but as an equal, his hand resting firmly and protectively on the small of her back. The world saw a mafia boss and his unexpected queen, but Leora knew the truth was much deeper than a title. She turned her gaze away from the horizon, looking directly at those watching her story unfold. Her voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of everything she had endured. She reminded them that true power isn't found in the cold steel of a gun or the endless numbers in a bank account. Those things can be taken away in an instant. Real power, she whispered, is the courage to stay kind when the world is freezing cold. It is the strength to see someone's humanity when everyone else chooses to look away. A small, knowing smile played on her lips as she leaned closer. "You think it was just luck?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with a sudden, chilling sharpness. "You think a girl like me just happened to be in that diner, on that exact night, at that exact moment?" She reached into a small velvet drawer nearby and pulled out a weathered photograph. It wasn't a picture of herself, but a surveillance shot of Evelina Varelli from weeks ago, taken from a distance. Leora hadn't been a victim of chance. She had been a guardian in the shadows long before the first SUV pulled up to the curb. She had known the storm was coming, and she had chosen to walk right into the center of it to ensure the silver-haired woman survived.